So, hi, welcome
Hi,
for joining us. Could you introduce yourself?
my name is Nick O'Neill.
Okay. And what is your relationship with Bergen County?
I live in Bergen County. I haven't always lived in Bergen County. I grew up in the UK and moved here 9 years ago. Yeah, about 9 years ago.
Okay. And could you tell me what is your relationship to the LGBT community?
I'm an openly gay man. I'm married to you, as it happens. And so I guess that's my relationship to the LGBTQ
And we have a
community.
daughter.
And we have a daughter.
Yes. All right. So the whole point of this is to raise awareness, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, what is your thoughts on the fact that coming from the UK and then coming here, what do you think about the fact that Bergen County does not have an LGBT center?
Well, I mean, Bergen County is one of the richest counties in the US, right? So globally, that makes it one of the richest places on earth, essentially. And so, if anywhere has the resources to provide a center for this community, Bergen County surely is one of the areas that does and should, right?
Mhm.
So I'm kind of shocked that there isn't a lot more resource for this community, particularly being so close to New York, being part of the country that's comparatively pretty liberal, and has, like most of the US, a fairly large proportion of its population comparatively that fits into the LGBTQ community, right?
Yeah. And so, what do you think the impact of not having a center, how do you think that impacts the community at large? Not just the LGBT, but also the larger community.
Well, I mean, I guess I come at this from a slightly different angle to a lot of people that you interview. Um, so growing up in the UK during the 70s and 80s, um, probably more so than this part of the US, being gay was certainly not something that was generally accepted. I was a lawyer, an attorney, practiced in the UK for a number of years before coming here. And certainly when I first started my career, if you were openly gay in the kind of law firm I was in, which was a very big international law firm, you would have either been sacked or you certainly wouldn't have had a career for very long, right? And so a lot of, but as I, you know, grew more established in my career and then I became partner of the law firm I was in, it so happened that coincided with, from a sort of corporate and commercial world point of view, being LGBTQ was then became acceptable. And so certainly one of the things I focused on in the latter part of my career, I'm recently retired, is working to make it more acceptable to be gay, to be lesbian, and increasingly actually towards the latter part to be transgender too, in the firm that I was working in. And that was where I tried to make something of a contribution because it became much, much more acceptable. And in fact, it was something that, we almost marketed as a law firm that we were very accepting, etc., etc. And so I saw that as a way of giving back. So, I mean, I think if you had some sort of center here, that would allow for a much broader part of the population, because I was in this, almost like select little kind of elite commercial world, to also have that greater level of acceptance and awareness that I just don't think really still exists in the broader population.
Mhm.
right? And so I think it's not just the facilities that it would allow, but it's also kind of broadening out the acceptance to the broader community. Obviously allies are very important, but I think the more you have that, the more allies you're going to get and the more you're going to generate in terms of awareness.
Yeah.
As well as the fact that, there are just a huge number of facilities around here that don't exist and that should exist, and you end up with a lot of people just going off to New York because that's where, for the East Coast, so much of this community is, but needs to go there to get service because that's really where a lot of the resources are.
Mhm. So you sent me a really interesting article today about the cost of racism, right? So that's sort of like where I'm going with this is what do you think the cost of lack of having a center?
Well, I mean, the article you're talking about is something which is highlighting the fact that if you had more people of color, particularly in boardrooms in the US, that a lot of studies have shown that a more diverse senior management in companies makes for higher levels of profitability, right? I mean, that has been studied and been found to be the case. And, from the sort of legal corporate world I came from, that was the conclusion people had reached by certainly around sort of, the middle of the first decade of this century.
Yeah.
And so, there was definitely a commercial, it wasn't just, a piece of fluff that we were sort of keen to have a more diverse approach, not just with LGBTQ, but also, with race, with gender, etc. But it also makes a huge amount of commercial sense because, it's just been proven that a more diverse workforce is helpful to the bottom line, right? So for a community, the same must surely follow, that if you provide the resources required for a minority population, that minority population is more likely to flourish, at least to a certain extent, right? So you're more likely to have people who are getting jobs and holding those jobs down. You're getting more people who, for instance, if they're transgender and want to transition, the access to that means they can be more themselves and be more productive as individuals, right? If you're gay and you feel more accepted in your community, then you're much more likely to, progress further in that community, whether it be in a career or, maybe it's because you get involved in the not-for-profit world or whatever. So essentially, by having that greater level of acceptance, that greater level of resource, the community, which is probably 5-6% of the population, is going to be benefited. And that's going to benefit everybody because those people add more back to a certain extent. If you've got a good paying job or a better paying job, you pay more taxes, right? That's an obvious thing. But if you're encouraged as an individual, or you are allowed to become more yourself, whether that's transgender, whether it's gay, whether it's lesbian, bisexual, whatever, then you are going to contribute more because you feel more comfortable in the community and the society that you exist in. So that must follow, right? And if you've got a community, which we have in Bergen County, or around 1 million people, rough figure, assume 5% of those people are LGBTQ. That's what, 50,000 people, right? Even if you get like 10% of that population to increase their productivity, their involvement in society, whatever, by another 10%, that's a lot. Probably pays for itself, at least.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, so what kind of if you had a guess, like what kind of revenue loss do you think that is happening right now? Like just
Ooh.
guesstimate. You know what I mean?
I don't know, but I mean, you get say 50,000 people,
Hmm.
rough guess. I don't know what the average income in Bergen County is. Is it something like 70,000, 70, 80,000 a year,
Yeah.
something like
Yeah.
that?
I think it's actually more.
But
I
say
think
it's
it's
that
close to
level,
100,000.
say it's that level, and you can reckon that population is maybe not sort of realizing its potential. Then that can easily be 50,000 people with, I don't know, 10% lower wages or something. That in itself becomes quite a big number, right? And it's not, I mean, everybody, a lot of people think about things in terms of dollars, right, and dollar values. But it's also more than that. You can't really put a figure on
Mhm.
somebody's dignity or
No.
somebody's engagement or whatever. You know what I mean? So there's hard figures, which I'm sure if you spent the time, you could, get more information about that and produce like hard dollar figures. But there's also the sheer fact that you're talking about people's, human dignity too.
Yeah. Yeah. And absolutely. That's absolutely true. And when we talk about this to people, this is where they take it is just on that level of dignity and we have a right, and this is absolutely true. But I want to show that there's another side. We have a county that is, you know me, my thoughts are sort of like very military, we're going to run this ship, we're going to run it right, kind of mentality. So to me, that's poorly managed. You understand what I'm saying? That's a lost opportunity. And that opportunity, we're looking at these hard numbers, but what is the impact of, because we're having children, we've always been having children. So that's also increasing that number because their children are being impacted negatively. And so it grows. It's a much larger number than we can actually just come up with. And that's a real impact on our community. That's a negative impact that could be rectified, you know? And
Right.
we're actually going in the opposite direction because, not only are they not flourishing, the many people are actually in duress and they need services because of it. They need therapy, they need, mental health situations, they need addiction situations, they need housing, they have, criminal records. All this accrues more in our community, so instead of going up, we're going back, and that's been the way
Right.
it's been. It's to me, it looks like that's the cost that a lot of people are paying so they can just ignore our existence. Do you know what I mean?
Right. So you're right. I mean, not only is it you have a population that isn't realizing its potential, but actually it's becoming negatively impacted because of the fact that it doesn't have those services which could, get a lot of those individuals out of difficult situations, which are costing society more, right? I mean, people who have drug issues and are not treated, that is going to be a cost in various ways to society too,
Yeah,
right? In some cases, at extreme level through incarceration. That costs. It's very costly to keep somebody in jail.
yeah,
Whereas if you had a preventive, if you had the like preventive services, like as you say, counseling and therapy and those sorts of things available, much more available and accessible to this part of the population, which is very vulnerable to drugs often, that in itself saves society a big cost. So it's not just, as you say, it's not just kind of raising people up, it's also trying to provide some sort of reduction of risk and harm,
Exactly.
which would in the long term cost society more money.
Exactly. Yes. So the question is, how do we show this to people?
Well, I mean, as I say, I think it's at least possible to pull together statistics which show some of that.
Yeah.
Whether he'll show all of it, I don't know.
So I mean, all right. So I mean, all right. So the next part of this, I think we can talk about is so the whole point of this is to raise awareness, right? So you've been in very, influential, powerful meetings with powerful people, and you know that world, and you know politics, and you know that far better than I do, and I think most people would do. A lovely child. Um, my question to you is, so this is to raise awareness, because from my perspective, people are disconnected to the actual issues. Like the perception is LGBT people are the privileged because they don't have children, they don't get married, so they have this huge amount of indispensable money. And that may be true for some, a small portion, but when you apply the breadth of LGBT, that's absolutely not true. You know, you, you know, um, the fact that we don't see many lesbian clubs is really, attributed to men generally have the wage, the pay, the money gap between men and women. That's the reason why you don't see that many lesbian clubs, especially when we were growing up, and there was clubs everywhere. You know, so it's not true LGBT people have so much money that they're fabulously wealthy. There are some, of course, but the majority is not true. So my question is like, what do you think is the approach, and what is the barriers, because there's so many people that have these perceptions that this is what LGBT is. It's the 80s effeminate gay man, and that's the extent of it. And it's not. We have a lot more poverty. We have a lot of gap in between education and development because people are struggling, because schools were horrific growing up, and bullying and all that kind of stuff. New Jersey's a lot better, but there's still a long way to go. So what do you think is the best way to move forward and to get people to understand this and to incite change? Because you did that in your organization, you did that at your firm. You opened an LGBT group where in your career you could have been fired, and then you end up and you're creating this amazing thing that is now international throughout the entire world. That's your doing. How can we do that here?
Well, I think again having some sort of center, whether it's virtual or real, like bricks and mortar or online. I mean, what you're doing now, having all these interviews, right? Publicizing that is a good first step because people can see the sheer diversity of people and their experiences that you're talking to. And if you have some kind of local resource center, that gives you an ability to bring in, influencers like politicians, to bring in just the average guy in the street who might be interested. And then by word of mouth, that to spread that, there are, like, frankly, any population, there are people who are way more disadvantaged than maybe the, anchor on CNN or, film star that they see and think, well, it's okay because, all these gay people are wealthy and, live these fabulous existences, right? The other benefit, to my mind, is it helps make I'm not sure whether this is answering your question, but it's kind of related to it, that one of the things that having a broader publicization, a broader sort of spreading of the word about how, broad, diverse, and often disadvantaged parts of this community are, is you help to remind the wealthier and more advantaged parts of that community that maybe they have responsibilities to the rest of it, right? Which I think since the time of AIDS, people have forgotten,
Yeah.
right? You and I grew up, and in the 80s, people now, I think, forget how terrified the gay community, particularly kind of our age, where you're growing up, often not having come out yet with this plague going around that could easily kill you for doing what you wanted to do, have sex with somebody, right? People have forgotten that fear that then led to the community coming together.
Yeah.
And it's now spread apart again,
Yeah.
right? Because clearly it hasn't been cured as a disease, but it's no longer the death sentence that it was 30 plus years ago,
Yeah.
right? Maybe something like this helps to say to the part of the community that actually has a lot of the resources, hey, you guys, maybe you should come and help out. Maybe chip in financially, maybe help out in some other way. Because, there are a lot of rich, mainly white, but not all white, but there's a lot of rich LGBT folk out there, particularly in a community as wealthy as this, and engaging those people, yeah, it taps that resource, but it taps in another way too, which is, and this is something I've been thinking about as somebody who's recently retired, I kind of lost that ability to sort of give into the community in a way when I retired, because once we got to the point that it was much more acceptable, my view was push that door, which is ajar, fully open, so that for the next generation, it's much easier for them to be out at work in a career, and that would actually certainly not disadvantage you, right? Well, in the broader community, those people also kind of have responsibility. And you may well find that there are a whole bunch of people like me, maybe older, white, relatively advantaged individuals who are going, hey, I can give back now to my community in a way that some of them have maybe been doing through their job and career and whatever. So I think that's a related issue, but I think that could be a useful resource to kind of add into the pot too.
Yeah. And it's funny when you're talking about HIV and AIDS and the fear. I think the fear people perceived was they don't want to die. The gay people didn't want to die, but I think the fear was primarily we don't want people to find out, that we're gay and now to die with AIDS. And then you're thinking about your own mortality, you know? So, and it was horrible, horrible time because, you have someone who gets leukemia or, various forms of cancer and, that difficult moment, that the community, the family rallies around them and helps them and lifts them up, where the people in our community had to hide and then die alone in shame. And that's why I work, and people are still that's still happening. That's
Oh
still
yeah, no, I mean the stigma attached to it was even greater because of the community that it impacted, right?
yeah. Yeah. So one last question before we wrap this up, and this is really coming from my professor, and when we were talking. and talking about my project that that you helped me with when I was doing at the UN about the good governance, you
Yeah,
know, indicator, and how you can tell a community thrives by how they treat the weakest link. And in most cases, the weakest link is LGBT people.
right, right.
And some people are like, oh no, it's this minority or that minority. I was like, okay, but in those minority groups, you have LGBT people and they're treated worse. You know what I mean? So for that purpose, that weakest link, you can tell, and it's correlated, goes hand in hand. The ones that treat people the worst is usually countries that struggle most of the time, and
Yep,
they're definitely not countries that you want to move to generally, right?
yep, yep.
Unless you enjoy killing gay people, right? So, and conversely, the countries that are the most open and the most um, supportive of the community are usually the ones that are doing amazingly well, like the Netherlands and places like
Yep,
that, right? So here in Bergen County, the perception is Bergen County 201. That's a amazing area code. That means you've made it. You're in a rich community. That's the kind of the perception I grew up, in this area. But it doesn't really correlate with that. It's a very wealthy area, but the treatment is we don't exist. We don't have LGBT population.
right.
So my question to you is, you coming from, across the pond and having a completely different perspective. What's your take on that?
Well, but I would say the main reason, or certainly one of the primary reasons why Bergen County is as wealthy as it is because of its proximity to New York.
Yeah,
It's basically part of a large. I mean, there's the river there, but essentially it's greater New York City, right?
yeah,
And if New York City wasn't the vibrant, diverse, liberal place that it is, it wouldn't attract the number of people who have resource and wealth that it does. Some of whom, yeah, come and live out here with their family, right? So I don't think you can say, well, Bergen County can ignore this because it's wealthy anyway, because it's partly wealthy, not necessarily by its own means, but by the fact that people just happen to have relocated here because they can get a bigger house and an apartment in the city. But the other thing to bear in mind is as time goes by, and obviously it does have its own economy and its own employment base, etc., etc. One of the things big corporations do kind of care about is diversity and the ability for politicians who are looking to attract those people to be able to say, well, look, this is an example of how good we are with particular parts of particular minorities can actually be a selling point for an area, right? Conversely, not having any of that can be a detraction. Whereas another community which is looking to attract the same employer might be advertising their LGBT center. I mean, a good one of the sort of analogous points, if you like, is one of the reasons the corporate world realized how important LGBTQ is when during the 90s there was pretty much full employment, and then the dot-com bubble, but then it came back again. Certainly with the kind of professional services type world, there was this huge war for talent, right? Where everybody wanted the people who were graduating top of their class in Harvard, Yale, Cambridge, Oxford, wherever around the world, right? And if those people happened to be LGBTQ, they wanted them too. Like they wanted the women and the colored you know, the people of color who graduated top of their class. They wanted all those people, right? And they wanted the bigger proportion of them, because the more they get, the better their firm does, whether it's Goldman Sachs or a law firm like mine or the big accountancy firms, whatever. Interestingly, though, and people have looked at this, because one of the groups they want is more women. Half the population, lots of very, very talented women coming out of the top colleges in the world. Do you know, though, what the women tend to look at in an employer? The last few years, they haven't really looked at how much do you take care of women, how much do you promote them, etc., because everybody says they do that. What women graduates actually look at is how they treat the LGBTQ population. There's been studies done on it. It's true, they do, because they see it as a more genuine reflection of true equality, right? I'm not saying the same thing follows, but I do think, to your point about it's one of the key indicia of progress in a country, you know, and also when people look for talent, I think it's also going to be something which at a local governmental level kind of should be looked at, because it's a key indication of how well a local area treats its population, right? When it deals with the least of these kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, amazing, right? I hope you had some fun. So for the, this is being recorded, this is going to be made public because we discussed this late at night. Do you give consent?
Yes, I do.
And do you feel comfortable with everything you spoke about while on this video?
Yep.
And do you, that at any given moment, for any reason or no reason at all, if you say, hey, I don't want this, you just have to allow me a little bit of time to get home and take it off for your concern, right? And just want to say thank you, like genuinely thank you, because you're my husband and you supported me, and I wouldn't had access to this world at the education level and this without you, right? So thank you for supporting me, thank you for inspiring me, and just thank you for being wonderful. Okay.
Well, thank you for doing all this. It's a huge amount of work.
We are doing this. All right, say bye.
Bye.